Welcome to another Digital Anarchy tutorial. I'm Jim Tierney, president of Digital Anarchy, and in this tutorial we're going to be talking about Primatte 5.0, discussing the newly improved auto mask feature, and also going over the basics of the user interface, and then talking about how to create a manual mask. So let's dive into it. The first thing we're going to do is turn our layer into a smart object, because this is a great way of working with filters in Photoshop. We have a whole tutorial on working with smart objects and smart filters, so I highly recommend checking that out. It's a really nice way of improving your workflow. Smart filters are non-destructive, as we'll see a little bit later. And if you convert your layer into a smart object, any filters you apply are automatically applied as a smart filter. And that includes Primatte for sure. So we'll go to the filter menu, go to Digital Anarchy, select Primatte, and that will launch the Primatte UI. So there's some new stuff going on here. You'll notice that we have the backdrops and overlays section. This allows you to composite backdrops and overlays directly within Primatte. In this case, we're going to be using Photoshop to create the backdrops. But just to show you how it works, if you want to add a backdrop or an overlay, you just click on the plus button here, and this will bring up a browser window. And we can browse around to where we have our Primatte files and select background. And this will load in the background from the hard drive. You can see that it's now listed here. If we want to get rid of this background, we can click the minus button and it will delete it. One important thing to note is that the render BD button, the render backdrop button, is necessary if you're going to have Primatte render this out. If you just want to see the backdrop for preview purposes, you can leave this turned off. But if we actually want this to render out to Photoshop, we need to have render backdrop turned on. And that will tell Primatte that we want to have the subject and the backdrop all composited together and rendered right back out to Photoshop. Otherwise, it will render out our subject on transparency. And that's actually what we want in this case. So I'm going to turn off render backdrop. And I'm also going to select my backdrop and delete it. Because again, we're going to use Photoshop to add in the backdrop, so we want our subject on transparency. And by turning off render BD, that's what we'll get. Now another big section that we've added is the move section. And this allows you to take the subject, the overlay, or the backdrop and reposition it, rotate it, or scale it. And so in this case, I'm going to select the subject. We can grab our position tool and move her around if we want. Undo that. We can also rotate her around, do some crazy things. Flip her upside down, or just slightly give her a tilt. But in this case, we really don't want any of that, so we're going to undo that. And of course, we can scale. I wouldn't recommend scaling the subject usually. Usually this is better for the overlays and the backdrop. But in this case, we're just going to leave our model alone. And so I'm going to turn the subject button off. If you do have a backdrop, we also now have a backdrop blur. You can blur out the background to sort of simulate a depth of field look. We have fixed lighting, which if you have a green screen that has wrinkles in it, or if you've got a lot of variation in the shading, so you've got like some darker areas, you've got some lighter areas, fixed lighting will help with that. In this case, we've got a little bit of variation, but it's not too severe. Some lighter colors here, some darker shades here, but it's really not too significant. This is a pretty well shot image. Also, light wrap has been improved. If you take a look at the light wrap settings, you can see we have a bunch of new blend modes, and we've also improved the quality of the light wrap. So you should get a much nicer light wrap if you're trying to composite the subject with a specific background. And that's not what we're doing here, so we'll turn light wrap off. But the main thing to notice that's new in Primatte 5.0 is the auto mask button. And by default, auto mask is turned on. If I take a look at my auto mask settings, you can see it's set to always on. And you can see every time that you launch Primatte, it's going to automatically try and key the image and apply some color correction to it. And that's what this means. Now, the only setting here that you really want to change is the radius setting. If you have a lot of flyaway hair, you might want to set this up to like 80 or 90. The default values for spill suppression and color correction are pretty good values. You're not going to want to change those too frequently. By default, they should work out pretty well. But you might want to adjust the radius, or if you always want to manually mask your images, you can turn always on to off. But these are pretty good settings, so we're going to leave that alone for the time being. Because in fact, what we want to do in this case is not use auto mask, but create a manual mask to show you how that process works. And it's a pretty simple process. And this is really only if auto mask doesn't work. Now, if you have a nicely shot image, as we do here, auto mask should succeed a high percentage of the time. You really shouldn't have to do a lot of manual masking. But every now and then, it's definitely something that you might run into, so it's really important that you know how to do it. So we're going to switch back to composite mode. And the first step is to select our step 1 and click on the green area. And then the first thing I want to do is change my selection tool to box. For the manual masking process, the box works much better. If you're doing spill correction, then the point tool works much better. So for creating the mask, we'll grab our box selection tool and just create a small box in the middle of the green background. And what this is going to do is set the green color that we're trying to key out. So we're telling primatte, this is the color I want to get rid of. And if I take a look at my mask now, you can see it's done a pretty good job of that. But you'll notice that the background is a little bit uneven. We've got some lighter shades, we've got some darker shades, and that's being reflected in the gray that you're seeing here. And so the next step is to grab our clean background tool and expand the green color range to include those skin tones. And so we do that by dragging a box around those tones. And we can see that that improves our mask, improves our background. And we'll do that for the gray values we have down here. So now we've got a really nice background mask. The subject still has a little bit of gray, and we really don't want that, especially not on areas that are supposed to be completely opaque. And so we'll move to the clean foreground tool and just click and drag on those areas. So that takes care of the dress. We'll come up here to where her eyes are, click and drag around the eyes. And that's going to create a really nice mask. We've got black where the background is, which means that's going to be fully transparent. We've got white where the subject is, meaning she's going to be fully opaque. And we've got a little bit of gray around the hair. And that's something that we want because, again, we've got the background showing through the hair. So we want to keep some transparency there. We don't want these strands of hair to be fully opaque because that's not what they are in the original image. We want some of the background that we're going to add into it to show through them. And so that's why you want to have a little bit of gray there, and that's just fine. So now we can take a look at our composite. You can see that we've got a really nice key. Most of the hair is kept together very nicely, and we can zoom in even further. But you will notice that there is a little bit of green spill around the hair. And so we're going to take care of that by grabbing our spill minus tool, changing the selection tool to point, and we're going to start clicking and dragging on the areas that have a green tint to it. And what this is doing is telling primatte to remove the green color component from these areas. Again, remember, we know what the green color is that we're trying to get rid of by what we did in step 1, by clicking on the green background. And so by clicking on the areas that have a green tint to it, we're just telling primatte to remove that green color from those areas. And it does a really nice job of it. Gives us a great look. And now we have a good mask. We've got good color correction, and we can render this back out to Photoshop by clicking OK. So that takes us back out to Photoshop. You can see if I remove this background here that I have my subject against transparency. It's created a really nice mask. The hair looks great. She looks great. We're all set. And so we can add in our background here. But of course, Since we're in Photoshop, we've got her on transparency. We could, of course, add in any background we wanted. We could, of course, add in any backdrop that we wanted. This is just the layer that happens to be here and that we kind of like. But if we want to add in a bunch of different backdrops to potentially show the client, say, hey, here's a bunch of different backdrops. Which one would you like to be against? We could certainly do that. And if we want to see what the original image looks like, we can turn off primatte and get right back to our original image. And so this is one of the benefits of smart filters. You can just turn them on and off at any point in time, even coming back 6 months later to this image, and you'll be able to revert back to your original image. But we're going to turn primatte on and show you what the final result's going to look like. So that's it for the tutorial. Remember that auto mask is by default turned on, so primatte should automatically pull the key for you. If that doesn't quite work out, then you can always use the manual masking tools. But auto mask should work most of the time, and so you really shouldn't have to go into doing the manual mask too often. And in this case, we've used Photoshop to add in the backdrop, but with the new sections within primatte, you can use primatte to add in the backdrops automatically if you want to make everything part of a batch process. That's a really great way of going. And look for the other tutorial on using primatte as part of a batch process. But that's it for this tutorial, so thank you for joining me. You can go to www.digitalanarchy.com and get more tutorials and free trial download of the software and a lot more other interesting stuff related around chroma key. And of course, we have a whole bunch of other products and free trials of those and all sorts of good stuff. So anyways, thank you again for joining me, and see you next time.